Welcome to the Sustainable Living Podcast. Tips, tools, and tactics for living a heart-centered life that honors Mother Earth and her inhabitants. The information shared on the Sustainable Living Podcast reflects the opinions of host Marian West, Janice Friant, and their guests. Please use your own discretion in research before applying any information to your individual situation. Now, here are your hosts,
Hello, everyone.
Marian
This is Marianne West with the Sustainable Living Podcast. And I'm here with a very special guest, somebody I actually have followed online for quite a while because she has a great presence as a blogger in the world of gardening and permaculture and everything related to that. And just recently, she wrote a book, and it's called The Suburban Micro-Farm. And I'm so excited to welcome Amy Stross to the Sustainable Living Podcast. Welcome, Amy.
Yay, thank you, Marianne. This is so nice to be here.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you about your book, but also a little bit about your journey. And first off, I was privileged to have a copy of the book. Amy sent me one, and I really, really like it. So you did a wonderful job, and I'm just very impressed. So I wanted to get that out of the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The title is A Suburban Micro-Farm. So it's talking about farming, but not farming out in the country. And I wanted to start out with why you concentrated on farming in the city.
Yes, well, that has a lot to do with my experience. I started out about 10 years ago getting into, I was sort of a late bloomer, but it was about 10 years ago when I started learning about sustainable food production, asking questions like, where does our food come from? And, the first step I took was to join a community-supported agriculture program. And for those of you who don't know, that's called CSA for short. And basically, I received a weekly share of produce from a farmer, and this was kind of a big operation. There were about 100 families involved, and I got to, as part of my share, I got to help out on the farm.
Oh, so see, when I read your book, I was like, oh, this is neat. She came to gardening through eating. Because you talk about having made a move, and you came from being a teacher, which actually explains a lot of what you're doing now. But so you actually got to work on the farm. So that's fabulous.
Yes, from there I was sort of hooked. But, it's interesting because working on that farm, this was a larger scale operation than a backyard. And that was my first experience with growing food. So I kind of, had this idea in my head that if you wanted to grow food for yourself, you needed a lot of space. And, I just had, a little 1/10 of an acre plot at my house in the suburbs. And I let it sit there without being used for a couple of years because I thought it wasn't big enough. And I even went so far as to join what I call a land share program, where I rented land from a property owner nearby. She had about 3 acres, I think, and I, rented some space to grow some gardens there. And in return, I gave her a share of the harvest. But, at the end of that year, I realized that I had been spending an hour in the car to get over to her house for farming my little plot on her land. And I realized this is something I can be doing in my own yard. And that was kind of where I made that first step to really, small scale residential gardening right in my own yard.
I love that. Right now, I think we're in a time where a lot of people are thinking about growing their own food. There is this movement going, and a lot of people share that opinions that you need to have a lot of land. We met in a Facebook permaculture group, and when I look at a lot of the different permaculture groups or gardening groups, the wish of owning 3 acres or more acres seem to be very prevalent. But you're saying we can do it right here in the middle of the city, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was for me, it was trial and error. Like, let's see what can happen if I try to come up with some solutions that really work in small spaces. And, the other thing is, not everybody purchases their home for its, food growing potential, right? So we have a lot of problems like shade and perhaps a sloping yard or maybe drainage problems. And so, what I wanted to do was try to figure out how can we find solutions for these challenges, that these barriers that might keep people from just having a garden, right outside their back door or their front door, and being able to provide some fresh produce for their tables.
So, what were some of the challenges you faced in the very beginning?
Well, at our yard, the backyard was very shaded. So I had, on one side, we had a big mulberry tree on one neighbor's property, kind of leaning over, and then a maple tree from another neighbor leaning over, and also an oak tree from a third neighbor sort of leaning over. And I thought that there was limited things that I could do with that backyard. And so I actually started with my front yard. And because that was where the sun was. And that was a whole different challenge because what I wanted to do was come up with solutions that helped it blend into the neighborhood rather than be sort of a sore thumb. Like I wanted to make a statement, but I didn't want it to be a big, loud statement. I just wanted it to be enjoyable.
That's good. I think people come from a lot of different viewpoints of that. Some people want to make a really loud statement and say, look, this can be done. And for others, it's more, especially if you live in a neighborhood where people might not be so open to what you're doing or where everything looks alike. It's probably a better approach to not make a huge splash, right?
Yeah, well, that was sort of the viewpoint that I was coming from. We were kind of newcomers in this neighborhood where it was kind of a tight-knit community, and we didn't want to, we wanted to do it in a way that might encourage others to give it a try. And so we did things like we used a lot of perennials. We planted black raspberries and cherry trees and strawberries and currant bushes in the front yard. And it was all very beautiful, but it was also fruit bearing. And of course, when you're wanting your neighbors to catch on, what are they more likely to try? A turnip or a strawberry?
Well, let me think about this question. Yeah, pretty obvious.
Yes. And especially with the neighborhood kids, if you want to connect with the neighborhood kids, growing strawberries and cherries was certainly a fun way to go.
So really, your garden was more than just producing food for yourself. It sounds you really were thinking about community building at the same time.
Yeah, I was. I wanted to find ways to connect with my neighbors, and sort of feeling like an outsider, I thought, well, strawberries make a nice gift. And so I, started, of course, we had plenty of harvest for ourselves, but then I would share fresh strawberries. And I also, around the holidays, I would make jams and, share those with the neighbors. And I think that it was a nice gesture. I think sometimes we have to give something to get a little back.
Yeah, certainly. It's usually like a two-way street. So did you find that neighbors came by and talked to you a lot when you were out front in your garden, or how did you connect with them?
Yeah, we did. I think our front yard is very wide open and exposed, I should say. We're close to a corner where two roads met, and so there were a lot of dog walkers and joggers and families going on walks together, and so yeah, it was just kind of easy when I was out picking cherries and somebody walked by. It was kind of easy to say, here, I have a handful of these. And we did form some special relationships with neighbors. There's one neighbor in particular that I really like the story about because he was a retired gentleman who lived in the backyard in back of us. And he was very pro lawn. He really enjoyed his lawn. And that was sort of one of his hobbies, was taking care of it. And when we dug up our front yard and planted these edibles, he was not very happy, and he didn't talk to us at first. But then at one point during the middle of the summer, he kind of wandered over, and his curiosity got the best of him, and he really wanted a tour. And so I kind of showed him around the front yard, and he was kind of grumbling at first, but when we got through with the tour, he said, this is just so beautiful, and I would have had no idea if you hadn't given me a tour. And in response, he offered a little plot of land in his backyard for us to have a little raised bed.
Oh, wow. So that really was a turnaround then.
It really was. And that was kind of a fun experience, because I got to, get the neighborhood kids involved to build the garden. And then I did most of the work, but I did share the harvest with the neighbors. And that was sort of a connector for us.
Yeah, that's great. When you were describing your property where it's located before, you were saying you get a lot of dog walkers come by. Now, did you build a fence around your front yard, or how do you prevent dogs to come in?
Good question. So for the most part, the dogs were pretty well behaved on leashes. And so there was lawn on sort of bordering the sidewalk, so that if they took a few steps off the sidewalk, they, weren't going to step into a garden. But one thing we did was we planted cherry trees in the parking strip. Now, everybody calls the parking strip something different, but what I mean by parking strip is that little space of land between the sidewalk and the street. And that was a very flat, wide open, sunny area. And I thought, I'm going to try planting something there. So we planted the cherry trees. And the reason why I chose the cherry trees was because I knew that they would, as a perennial, I knew that they would be able to stand up to the dog pee. And I also knew that they would not get trampled. And so I thought that was a good bet for the parking strip. And actually, it worked out very well. Talking about being good neighbors, we just made sure to keep them pruned so that they didn't hang over into the street or into the sidewalk, because nobody wants to have to walk around a tree branched so that they don't poke their eye out, or no one wants that fruit dropping on the streets and cluttering everything. So we just made sure that the trees stayed nice and pruned. But other than that, I think it was an excellent solution for that busy area.
Yeah, and cherry trees are so pretty when they're blooming. I mean, everybody wants to go to Japan to look at the cherry plumes, right? So you created that in your neighborhood right there. So in your book, you're describing some of the journey with the cherry trees. And in particular, I would love for you to talk a little bit about guilds, and then also how you had an incident with pests coming in. And
oh, great. I love that story. Yes. So, the idea of a fruit tree guild is taking a central element, I'll say, so that we don't make it too permaculture technology heavy. We'll just say taking a central crop, and in this case, it's a fruit tree. And underneath that fruit tree, we're going to plant some herbs that support the growth of it. And some of the herbs that I like will do a couple of things. They will keep animals out of it. Daffodils come to mind because deer and other digging animals don't like to go through daffodils. And we're going to pick herbs that, attract beneficial insects and pollinators. And we're going to find herbs that provide mulch and nutrients, fertilizers. And also, finding herbs that repel pests. And permaculture, we look for those plants that have multiple uses. And so, we don't have to have 20 plants underneath the tree to do that work for us. We can find a few that have multiple techniques or multiple jobs, I guess I should say. And so when we planted our cherry trees, I underplanted them with comfrey, and that's sort of one of those popular permaculture herbs that provides nutrients to the soil. And it also mulches. It provides a lot of leaf growth that can be chopped back and used as mulch. It provides habitat for insects and nectar for pollinators. And so it's a really wonderful, useful plant to grow underneath fruit trees. And then I also planted chives. And chives repel pests, and of course they have flowers that bring in pollinators. And I thought that, we were doing pretty good with that combination underneath our cherry trees out front. I think one of the things in conventional gardening, we think, okay, this is our area for cherry trees, and then the herbs go over here, and then the vegetables go over here, and we kind of separate things out. And I kind of like the idea of integrating things because that just kind of brings in more biodiversity. And so, we did this underneath the cherry trees, and they were so wonderful for a couple of years. And then suddenly I noticed something had gone wrong. The leaves were turning yellow, and they had black spots underneath it on the underside. And they were eventually falling off. And I thought, and I kind of got a little worried at first. And I thought, what is wrong with my trees? I need to do something to save them. And I discovered that the little black spots on the underside of the leaf was actually a very small insect. I searched all of the databases for information about cherry pests, and nothing came up like what I was seeing on my trees. And I didn't know, and I couldn't crack this mystery for quite a while, but then suddenly I realized that this same pest was on a nearby hawthorn tree. And I looked that pest up. It ended up being a hawthorn lacebug, which is not a common pest of cherries at all. And so I thought, well, this is strange. I guess they like cherries too. Now, instead of spraying this pest or something drastic, I went into observation mode and I looked around my yard and I realized that there was a plum tree that was completely untouched by this hawthorn lacebug. It was growing and it was happy and healthy and vibrant. And I wondered why the plum tree wouldn't be affected if the cherries were, because plums and cherries are in the same genus. It's called Prunus. And when I looked under the plum tree, I realized that daisies were growing there. And daisies happen to attract a beneficial insect called the green lacewing. And it turns out that the green lacewing is a control for this pest called the hawthorn lacebug. And so, this is sort of what permaculture is about, kind of doing this observation and becoming a detective. And so really what I thought was, I wonder if I put some daisies under my cherry trees, if that would, help bring in this green lacewing beneficial insect to help with this pest. So I did that. I also realized that one of the things that in permaculture that we really like to do is plant nitrogen fixers underneath our perennials because it helps fertilize them. And I had not done that under my cherry trees. And so I also brought in some clover to fix nitrogen for my cherry trees because my thinking was that perhaps my trees weren't as healthy as I wanted them to be. Maybe they needed a little more fertilization. So I brought in the daisies, I brought in the clover, and I didn't do anything else. I never saw the hawthorn lacebug again. They kind of disappeared. And, 2 years later, we got a really nice harvest, I think 27 pounds of beautiful pest-free cherries. And for me, that was sort of a living experience of using permaculture thinking to work my way through a problem.
Yeah, that's very beautiful because number one, a lot of people would choose to use something to spray on. And even in my opinion, and you can maybe speak to that as well, I feel even if you use an organic approved pesticide of sorts, it still kills beneficials and it still interrupts everything. And then another option would have been to go out and buy a whole bunch of the green laced, what is it called?
The green lacewing.
That's what I saw. Thank you. Because that's another option, is to buy beneficial insects, but instead you just encourage them to come in on their own, which I think it's brilliant. Plus it's cheaper and, and you really got to probably fix the problem much more permanently than doing anything else. Did they disappear out of the hawthorn tree as well, or just left your cherries alone?
Yes, there was a reduction in the pest of the hawthorn tree because, at that time when we had that outbreak, I was concerned about the hawthorn tree as well. But I didn't do anything different for the hawthorn tree. I didn't amend anything growing underneath it. I just kind of thought my first concern is these cherry trees that are in a very visible location. I want to make sure that they look good and are productive. So I didn't do anything for the hawthorn tree, but it seemed to bounce back as well.
Which makes sense. If there are more predators in the area, eventually they eat up everything on the cherry tree and then look for more food. And so the other tree will benefit as well. I wanted to come back to the cherry trees just because they're such a good example. So you used a space which would have been unused and probably fairly ugly otherwise. So you created more beauty in your neighborhood. And also you have sidewalks, I'm assuming.
Yes.
And a fruit tree usually doesn't have as vigorous of a root system like some of the other trees might have. Like in California, we have pepper trees, which go crazy, and others too, which can lift up sidewalks. So a fruit tree is a good option. And then also by keeping it trimmed, you are kind of, by trimming the top, you're also containing the root system, right?
Yes. I think you were right on there. I think the cherry trees are a really good solution for that area because I think the root system is a pretty, I don't know what the word is, but it's very light in the ground. It's not gonna, it's not gonna move a sidewalk like the roots of an oak tree or anything.
Right. Which would be a concern if you're planting someone on, say, my public property, or even close to your neighbor or close to your house. Those are kind of some of the things you want to think about.
Yes, that's right. Definitely want to be a good neighbor and think about, the strategies you're using and making sure that they are also friendly to your neighbors, similar to water catchment solutions. You want to make sure that you're being a good neighbor and you're not sending water their way and flooding their basement. You have to be a good neighbor when we think about making our yards a more productive space.
Right. So I want to come back to a couple of things, actually. And first, I want to come back to you as a person, because you shared in your books that you were in a different career. You were a high school teacher, and then you moved. And do you want to tell that story a little bit? I don't want to, tell your story since I have you here. You can tell your story.
Yeah, sure. I had been a high school teacher for a number of years, I think 6 years to be precise. And I wasn't happy in my job. I think that I realized through that experience that working in a traditional classroom was just, not for me. But realizing that was very stressful for me. As we all know, I'm sure that we've all been in jobs that didn't serve us, and it can have effects on your well-being. And so I was also dealing with an autoimmune disease at the time, and I was very worried. I had just recently gotten engaged, and I had moved to a new city, and I thought, I really need to take a break from teaching. And, this move to a new city is sort of a nice segue into something new. And now, as a type A personality, I was pretty worried about not having, the next thing lined up for myself. I've always been a hard worker, and I was worried about how that was, what I was going to do next, how I was going to contribute to my household. But it was through this experience with growing food, joining the CSA originally, and then after that, I found a job as a professional gardener working in landscapes. My boss happened to be a specialist with native plants and edible landscapes, and just working for clients that wanted something a little more unique in their yard, a little more biodiverse. And so she had never heard of the word permaculture, but I did learn a lot from her about growing food aesthetically, and that kind of contributed to my background and knowledge in that area. But through those experiences, I was just really hooked on this idea of growing food, and this idea of being able to provide for my household with things that were useful. We can provide for our households with money, and I think that is obviously we all need money to live. But this idea of providing fresh, healthy food for my household was also a gift that I got to realize and experience. And that kind of turned me around. It helped with the healing of my physical disease that I was dealing with, but then also my mental well-being as well.
Beautiful. Having fresh food can make such a huge difference, and having your hands into dirt. That's, there have been studies shown that there are bacteria in the soil which help your well-being, give you a better mood. So I wanted to talk to you about soil, because you make a huge part about soil. But right now, I wanted to ask you, when did you start blogging?
Well, good question. So I took my permaculture design certification in 2009, and that was a real eye-opener for me. This realizing that there was a structure out there already that kind of spoke to me as far as integrating our landscapes, our productive landscapes, with the rest of the ecosystem was just an incredible eye-opener for me. And learning how to design for that was incredible. And so those experiences really kind of shaped the experiments that I was doing in my own yard, which I named 10th Acre Farm, because we were on 1/10 of an acre. It was right around 2013 when I decided to start writing about those experiences. So that's when I started my blog, 10thacrefarm.com.
So that's how people can find your website, and you have a subscription, right?
Yeah, that's right. I deliver, of course, I write articles regularly for the blog, but then I also share a weekly newsletter. It usually goes out on Fridays. And so that has a lot of pretty fun information. I get a lot of positive feedback about the usefulness of those.
Cool. And then are you active on social media as well?
Yes, I am very active on Facebook. You can find 10th Acre Farm on Facebook. You can find us on Pinterest as well as Twitter. And I just started, just this week, I started on Instagram. So that is a new one for me. I don't have a very big following on there yet. I'm still trying to figure out how the platform works. But if you're an Instagram follower, you can look me up there too. It's 10th Acre Farm is my handle.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to look you up. I just started for the Sustainable Living Podcast Instagram too. And I find it kind of fun, because photos just really, I think they tell a big story. So yeah, I kind of like it. But then we see how that goes. Excellent. So can we talk about soil?
Sure, absolutely. I believe that I believe that soil is the essential foundation for everything else we're doing, because in industrial agriculture, we're losing topsoil at an alarming rate. Everything is tilled and then it kind of washes away, down our drains into our rivers, and then it goes out to the sea, and then we lose those nutrients, gone forever. That topsoil is essential for growing crops. We can't really grow crops without it. And so, that was one of my motivations for learning to grow in small spaces, because as much as we can use our residential properties for growing products for ourselves, for growing our own food, the less we're going to need reliance on those giant industrial monoculture style farms that really are stripping our landscapes away. And that was kind of, something that was a realization for me. I realized half of all Americans now live in the suburbs. So what happens if we, as suburbanites, can look for ways to use our spaces more productively? We've got a lot of lawn to play with. And I also realized that there was a study done by the University of London, England, and they compared 1 acre of backyard garden which is a lot in my opinion, but 1 acre of backyard garden
huge.
to 1 acre of industrial farmland. And they were curious to see which one would be more productive. And what they discovered was that the backyard garden was actually 3 times more productive than the farmland. And that's because when you walk out your back door, you can really get to know that landscape. You can get to know its nooks and crannies. You can get to know it intimately, know what its needs are, which are unique. Every little piece of land has unique characters, and the farmers that are growing on, hundreds, maybe thousands of acres at a time, they can't give any one of those acres any amount of attention. And so it turns out that the backyard garden is actually more productive. So when I think about residential growing, growing in the suburbs, I think, we have a real opportunity here to change the overall ecology of our landscape, because we can rely less on those industrial farms. And, it may take generations to change the course of industrial agriculture, but I believe that with this upswing in interest and, backyard gardens, I think that we might be headed in that direction. And I am excited about that because I think, as you alluded to, I think taking care of our soils is very important. And when we can do so in our little plots in our backyard, we might think it's insignificant. But indeed, I do believe that it's all the small parts that make the whole that are really sort of creating this snowball effect.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I almost think it's probably with also new technologies coming out with vertical growing and stuff like that, the number of efficiency might even go up. Said it's more than 3 times as effective to really use every inch, every part of your backyard. But do you think people have the time to do that? Most people are so busy all the time. What do you say to somebody who says, I have no time to garden?
I do think that in our modern culture, there will be my frank answer is that we will have to be realistic about what we can do and what we can't do, because obviously, I'm not superwoman, we're not super people. We might not be able to do all of the things, working full time, and we're raising kids, and we're chauffeuring our kids to a lot of activities, and, maintaining our home and preparing fresh meals. And just thinking about all of those things can make someone feel pretty, exhausted just thinking about it. But when we want to fit in garden, we can do it. We have to be very intentional about it, and we have to make it a part of our daily routine. And, for most of us, we're thinking, oh, yeah, right. How can I fit garden into a routine that includes all of those things? And the solution I came up with, and I tried this on my own for several years, because, once I started getting involved and growing some of my own food, I realized that I was growing all of my own food. I was preparing all of the meals. I was preserving the excess. I was teaching classes in my community. I was coordinating my local community garden. And I was, doing all of these things. I also was starting my blog where I was writing, and I was writing magazine articles, things like that. And I thought, my life, when I started out on this path, I was just gardening in my backyard, and it was very healing. And now I have to make it a part of my routine, or else I'm too busy to get to it. And so it was as much for myself as it was for my readers that I came up with the solution of the 15 minutes a day garden. And now, if you already have gardening as part of your routine, you might be thinking 15 minutes is nothing. But I'm telling you, I tried this and it definitely worked. My strategy is to find 15 minutes in your day, every day, that you can go out to your garden. And you're going to walk the garden. You're going to notice things that need assistance. Maybe you see a zucchini that needs harvested, or some crops that definitely need a good watering. I like to do the 15 minutes a day in 2 chunks. So I'll go out in the morning with my morning coffee for about 7 minutes. I'll walk through. It's kind of a meditation for me, really. I'll walk through the garden, notice what might need to be done. And then when I get home in the evening, I will come out for 8 minutes. So for a total of 15 minutes of the day, that 8 minutes when I come home, I already know what needs to be done, and I'll walk out. I'll even set a timer, and I'll pick a bunch of lettuce for a dinner salad, pull a bunch of tomatoes off the vine and, for the salad, and I can do a quick watering of a crop that needs it. And it's just a really good way to experience the garden through the seasons, and then also help to create a routine for yourself. Even if you're really busy, we can all find 15 minutes. A lot of us nowadays in the modern world will spend 15 minutes on Facebook or, another social media, but 15 minutes in the garden can go a long way. Now, of course, if you can build on that in future years, that would be ideal, but we want to start out with something that we can accomplish. We don't want to set ourselves up for failure. We want to set ourselves up for success. And so my motto has always been, if we start out with low expectations, we're going to be successful. And, successful makes us feel good. And we don't need more things in our life that stress us out and make us feel like failures.
For sure. And it's excellent advice to start small and keep it manageable. It's the one I have to constantly remind myself, because I love to see new things and try to implement, and then it's like, no, don't do more. Because then when you walk out and do said walk, it becomes overwhelming if there are too many projects which need attention. So starting small is a really good idea. And then also, you have talked about perennials. We haven't talked about it yet, but it kind of comes in with the soils that you don't dig up your yard all the time, do you?
Right, that's correct. Those are 2 time-saving techniques that I really, subscribe to. I definitely think that if you're really busy, starting with a vegetable garden might not be, the best solution, because perennials are those crops that come back every year on their own, year after year. You don't have to replant them. They don't need regular cultivation. Mainly with perennials, we're going out once a year for the harvest time, right? For my cherry trees, I went out once a year for that cherry harvest time, which was incredible. And I went back maybe once or twice the rest of the year for a quick pruning to keep them in check. But, that is much different from growing vegetables that need that constant care. And so I definitely subscribe to perennials. And, the other thing about perennials is it's not only a time savings, but it's also a really solid choice for the ecologically friendly yard, because We don't have to disturb the soil on a regular basis. Once you've planted them, you're done disturbing the soil. And, that creates a lot of beneficial solutions for the yard because we're bringing in permanent habitat for insects and we're bringing in permanent mulch, right? These deciduous perennials are usually losing their leaves once a year. And so we're naturally mulching the ground, and that ground mulch will provide more habitat for beneficial insects. And so I think that perennials are a really solid choice for the edible landscape or for anybody who's really, wanting to garden but is having trouble because of time constraints. And then, the no-till garden is also a solution that I like. We're not disturbing the soil on a regular basis. We're going to just continue to build that soil up with organic matter on a regular basis. So, we're adding compost, whether that's homemade compost from the backyard or whether that's worm compost from a worm bin or whether that's leaves that you've collected, coffee grounds. I always get, every week I get 5-gallon buckets of coffee grounds from the local coffee shop. And so, we can continually add this organic matter to the soil, and we're building up that topsoil. And as I was mentioning earlier, this idea that our topsoils are washing away is a real problem. But I think we have a lot of organic material that is free that we can work with that will keep our soils healthy. But I think that going out and raking some leaves into the garden bed is actually much simpler and less time consuming than all of the tilling and cultivation that occurs in conventional garden beds.
For sure. And then by what you mentioned, well, in your book, you actually have quite a section on how to compost. So if people go, oh, compost, you explain it very well, how this can be done in a clean, non-smelly way. And really by doing that, we are also diverting things from the landfill, which is another problem we are facing in our time, just too much trash. So two things at the same time, building soil and having, well, three things. By building soil, we get better food and we send less stuff to the landfill. So it's a real win-win-win situation. One thing I wanted to mention, and if you want to talk on it a bit, you have this tip in your book about creating color gardens or purpose gardens. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, sure. I have had a really fun time in my front yard finding solutions that, made my front yard not just productive, not just ecologically friendly, but also pretty. I wanted them to be pretty. I wanted them to be enjoyable for my neighbors because my hope was that I was that old adage, be what you wish for the world to be. I'm, creating pretty landscapes and anytime anything is pretty, people are more inclined to be open to it. And so I came up with some pretty fun landscapes that were beautiful and productive. And so one of the things I really like is creating these gardens that are based on color schemes. So one of them that I really like is the red garden. And so, when I would do these themes in my front yard where everything that year that I grow is red. So I'm growing cherry tomatoes and those are red, and I'm growing red Swiss chard, or red stemmed Swiss chard, and I'm growing red nasturtiums, which is a really beautiful flower, and it's a ground cover that protects the soil underneath the crops. And I'm growing cayenne peppers and things like that. So that's sort of, the concept that I was going for, that we can make this fun and beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, and you have some nice charts in your book to give suggestions how to do the yellow garden and the red garden. So I really liked that.
Yeah, one of my realizations about the edible landscape was, and I learned this, early on, because when we designed our front yard garden, I knew where I would be planting, but I didn't have a strong sense of what I would be planting. And so originally, I had a lot of annuals in there. And, vegetables. I wanted a lot of vegetables because I wanted to make it pretty, but I also, wanted to sort of make that statement. I was right on that edge. But what I realized was annuals, once you harvest them, a lot of times you've got this big open spot. And in the front landscape, it's not super helpful. I know one year I planted garlic and it was so beautiful. We had a really gorgeous spring with lots of rain, and as the garlic came up, those shoots were just this bright, vibrant green color. And I thought, this is just a wonderful crop for the front yard, and just the texture of the leaves. I was really proud of myself. And then I harvested that garlic in June. And then suddenly there was this big empty spot front and center in the front yard. And I had a solution for that. I planted seeds to grow winter squash. That was the thing that I was going to fill that space with. But it turns out that no matter how many times I seeded it, that winter squash never came up. And so it made me realize, if we're going to plant stuff in our front yard and our edible landscape, we want to choose crops that don't do that, right? So I turned to crops that are sort of what I call cut and come again. So we're talking about Swiss chard, kale, collard greens, leafy greens where you cut and then they grow back. You cut the leaves that you want and then they grow back. And then also fruiting vegetables so that you can plant them as seedlings, like tomatoes and peppers and, sometimes cucumbers, sometimes squash.
Right.
And then, for sure that plant is going to come up. And then when you need to harvest, you're not pulling out the whole plant, you're just harvesting the fruit. And then at the end of the season, we're not ripping out all of the annuals because that disturbs the soil, but we're just cutting them off at the base. So all of those leafy greens, I knew that in my climate, because it gets really cold over the winter and they will certainly die back, but I can cut those off at the base, and tomato plants, Swiss chard plants, all of the annuals, and I leave their roots intact in the ground. And what that does is over the winter, even though those spots might look empty, those roots are still holding that soil in place. So as the soil goes through that freeze-thaw cycle in our winter and early spring, we're not encouraging soil erosion. And those roots will, over time, decay and feed the soil life. And so we can grow annuals, but we can just do it in a more biodiverse way. We can increase the ecology.
Yeah, and it's easier and better. So that's great. Amy, is there some you would like to share we haven't touched on yet?
Let's see. I don't think so. I think this has been a really enjoyable conversation.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on. And before we go, what is the best way for people to buy your book?
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. I should mention that. So The Suburban Micro-Farm is the name of my book. And you can find more information about that on my book's website. That's thesuburbanmicrofarm.com. But you can find that for sale in a lot of places. Probably the easiest way to find it is on Amazon.
Okay. I will link to that. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Amy. I really, really appreciate it.
This was great, Marian. Thank you very much.
I hope you all enjoyed this conversation with Amy. And I highly encourage you to buy her book. I am a somewhat experienced gardener, and I certainly have taken a few permaculture design courses, but I still really enjoyed reading through Amy's book and looking through it. There are some pretty cool pictures in it. If you buy Amy's book as an ebook, also pictures are going to be in color, while the print edition has black and white pictures. So you might want to choose to go with the ebook option, right? I wanted to thank you so much for being part of our podcast. And in this episode, where we talked a little bit about Instagram, and Amy has started an Instagram account, and so have we with a Sustainable Living podcast. So please go on over and check it out and maybe follow us. And also what we like to do for our Instagram account, if you have any projects around sustainability you would like to share, please send us a picture. The email is sustainablelivingpodcast@gmail.com. That's probably the easiest to reach. Send us a picture and a little write-up, and we would love to feature you on our channel and on Facebook and so forth. And speaking of featuring, we have started a Patreon account and already have some people supporting our work here at the podcast. So if you don't know what Patreon is, it's basically the idea of, there used to be the idea of the patrons of the art, said a Da Vinci and a Rembrandt and a Bach and so forth. Not that we're anywhere close to those people, but anyways, people were able to practice their art because somebody with money was supporting them. And Patreon has taken on that idea, saying, well, it doesn't have to be this one rich person supporting a creator, somebody who writes, somebody who podcasts, somebody who paints, somebody who basically offers their work up to the world to hopefully make a difference of some kind. And we are in that category. We are podcasting because we want to bring you information. We want to give a ray of hope in our world, which sometimes everything seems so overwhelming when we hear about oceans being polluted and all kinds of stuff. It can become overwhelming. We want to bring you solutions, something we all can do, bring you interviews with people which are inspiring one way or another. So that's our offering to you, and we would love for you to support us, even with $1 a month. And it's pretty easy. So Patreon is a crowdfunding platform. You can go to patreon.com and look for us, Sustainable Living Podcast. There are little rewards, like we're going to shout out your name in the podcast and collect seeds and send you seeds. And there are all different kinds of little offerings. They're not something which are of tremendous monetary value, because the idea behind it really is that you want to support us to do this work because you also think it's important. And if you do so, if you choose to do so, we really appreciate it. We have a website, sustainablelivingpodcast.com, and I certainly will have links there for everything we talked about today, and also for our Instagram, for Amy's Instagram, and for our Patreon site. I thank you so much for being our listeners. Without you, it just wouldn't be as much fun if we were just to sit in front of a microphone and know that nobody's listening. So we really, really appreciate you. We know you're out there, we know you're listening, and we see our numbers, and we appreciate you. And please let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like us to talk about, or any body in particular you would like for us to interview. That's it for today. Bye for now. Have a beautiful week.